Marcus Chun adjusted his stethoscope around his neck as he walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's General Hospital. The morning shift was beginning, and the emergency department buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Nurses hurried between rooms, doctors reviewed charts, and the constant beeping of monitors created a familiar symphony that had become the soundtrack to his life over the past 8 years. At 34, Marcus had the steady hands and calm demeanor that made him one of the most respected paramedics in the city. His colleagues knew him as someone who never panicked, never hesitated, and could find a pulse in the most desperate situations. What they didn't know was that these same steady hands had once held a different kind of instrument entirely, a precision rifle that could hit targets from over a mile away. Marcus had served 3 tours as a military sniper before transitioning to civilian life. The skills he'd learned in the mountains of Afghanistan, patience, focus, reading environmental conditions, and making split-second decisions under pressure, had translated surprisingly well to emergency medical care. But he'd buried that part of his past so deeply that even his closest friends at the hospital had no idea about his military background. The transition hadn't been easy. After his discharge, Marcus had struggled with the typical challenges many veterans face: finding purpose in civilian life, dealing with the weight of memories, and discovering a new identity beyond the uniform. He'd tried several jobs, from security work to construction, but nothing felt right until he enrolled in paramedic training. Something about saving lives instead of taking them appealed to the part of him that was trying to heal. Dr. Sarah Williams, the head of emergency medicine, greeted Marcus as he checked in for his shift. "Good morning, Marcus. We've got a busy day ahead. There's a conference happening downtown, and you know how those events can get." She handed him the assignment sheet. "You're paired with Jenny today. Try to keep her from adopting any stray cats she finds during calls." Marcus smiled. Jenny Rodriguez was his regular partner, a 26-year-old paramedic with boundless energy and an unfortunate habit of wanting to rescue every animal they encountered during their rounds. Despite their different personalities, they worked well together. Her enthusiasm balanced his methodical approach, and her intuitive people skills complemented his technical expertise. "Where is Jenny anyway?" Marcus asked, scanning the ambulance bay. "Equipment check. Ambulance 7 needs restocking after yesterday's incident with the motorcycle accident." Dr. Williams paused, studying Marcus's face. "You okay? You look tired." The truth was, Marcus hadn't been sleeping well. The nightmares had returned recently, fragmented images of desert landscapes, and crosshairs that jolted him awake in the middle of the night. He'd thought those dreams were behind him, but stress had a way of bringing back unwanted memories. The job itself wasn't causing the stress, it was the growing tension in the city. Over the past few months, there had been a noticeable increase in violence. Gang activity was up, domestic disputes were more frequent, and there seemed to be an undercurrent of anger in many of their calls. Marcus had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, a skill honed during his military service, and lately, that sense had been more active than usual. "Just need more coffee," Marcus replied, forcing a casual tone. Nothing 8 hours of sleep, and a vacation wouldn't fix. Jenny appeared from around the corner, wheeling a supply cart toward their ambulance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same determined expression she brought to every shift. "Morning, partner. Ready for another exciting day of medical adventures?" "As ready as one can be," Marcus replied, grabbing his radio and medical bag from the locker. "What's our first call?" "Chest pain, downtown office building. 53-year-old male, possible cardiac event." Jenny was already climbing into the driver's seat. "ETA 15 minutes if traffic cooperates." As they pulled out of the hospital parking garage, Marcus settled into his familiar routine of checking equipment and reviewing protocols. But his mind was also unconsciously cataloging details that had nothing to do with medical care: the positions of other vehicles, potential cover if something went wrong, exit routes, and sight lines. It was an automatic process, something his military training had ingrained so deeply that he couldn't turn it off even years later. The call turned out to be a false alarm, anxiety rather than a heart attack. But Marcus noticed how his situational awareness had kicked in the moment they'd entered the office building. He'd automatically positioned himself where he could see both entrances to the lobby, noted the locations of security cameras, and identified potential threats among the gathering crowd of concerned coworkers. Jenny, focused on the patient, hadn't noticed any of this, which was exactly how Marcus preferred it. Their second call of the day took them to a residential area where a construction worker had fallen from a ladder. As Marcus worked to stabilize the man's injured leg, he found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with his therapist the previous week. Dr. Peterson had asked him about integration, how well he was blending his military experience with his civilian identity. The goal isn't to forget who you were, Dr. Peterson had explained. It's to understand how that person contributes to who you are now. Your military training gives you skills that make you better at your current job. The challenge is accepting that part of yourself without letting it define you entirely. Marcus had agreed intellectually, but emotionally, it was more complicated. There were aspects of his military service that he was proud of, the discipline, the precision, the ability to function under extreme pressure. But there were other aspects that he wanted to leave buried. The weight of taking lives, even in the line of duty, wasn't something that ever completely went away. Earth to Marcus. Jenny's voice broke through his thoughts. You're doing that thing again where you stare off into space. What's going on in that head of yours? Sorry, just thinking about the patient, Marcus replied, securing the splint around the construction worker's leg. Ready for transport? The afternoon brought a series of routine calls, a minor car accident, an elderly woman with breathing difficulties, and a teenager who'd had an allergic reaction to seafood. Each call required Marcus's full attention, and he was grateful for the distraction. When he was focused on medical care, the other part of his mind, the part that was always scanning for threats, could quiet down. It was during their dinner break that Jenny brought up something that had been bothering her. They were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, sharing a table near the window that overlooked the parking lot. Marcus had specifically chosen this seat because it gave him a clear view of anyone approaching the building, though Jenny assumed he just liked the natural light. Have you noticed anything different about the calls lately? Jenny asked, picking at her salad. I mean, people seem more on edge than usual. Yesterday's domestic violence call was particularly ugly, and that bar fight on Tuesday was way more intense than normal. Marcus had noticed the same trend. There was an underlying tension in the city that seemed to be building towards something, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. His instincts, honed by years of military service in hostile environments, were telling him that something was wrong. It was like the calm before a storm, when animals start acting strangely, and the air feels charged with potential energy. Maybe it's the heat, Marcus suggested, though he didn't believe his own explanation. People get more aggressive when it's hot. It's October, Marcus. And I've been doing this job for 5 years. This feels different. Jenny leaned forward, lowering her voice. Even the other crews are talking about it. Rodriguez from Ambulance 3 said they've been getting a lot more psychiatric emergencies lately. People having breakdowns, acting paranoid, talking about preparing for something. Marcus's attention sharpened. Increased paranoia and talk of preparation could be signs of several things: drug-related psychosis, social unrest, or something more specific. His military mind automatically began analyzing threat patterns, but he forced himself to stay in the role of concerned paramedic rather than former soldier. Have you mentioned this to Dr. Williams? Marcus asked. She's noticed too. Apparently, the police have been asking for more frequent welfare checks, and there's been an uptick in weapons-related injuries. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, but definitely a pattern. The conversation was interrupted by their radio crackling to life. Ambulance 7, respond to 1247, Oak Street. Possible overdose, 22-year-old female, unconscious but breathing. As they gathered their equipment and headed for the ambulance, Marcus found himself thinking about patterns and threat assessment. In the military, recognizing patterns could mean the difference between life and death. A change in local behavior often preceded attacks. Increased paranoia in a population could indicate that rumors or threats were circulating. The military had taught him to pay attention to these subtle signs. The overdose call turned out to be more complicated than expected. The young woman had taken a combination of prescription medications, and, as Marcus worked to stabilize her vital signs, he noticed something unusual. Her apartment was filled with survivalist supplies, canned food, water containers, first aid supplies, and what looked like preparations for an extended stay indoors. Jenny, look at this, Marcus called softly, gesturing toward the stockpiled supplies while continuing to monitor the patient's breathing. Looks like she was preparing for something, Ginny observed. Zombie apocalypse, maybe? Some people get really into that stuff. But Marcus recognized military-style preparation when he saw it. This wasn't hobby survivalism. This was someone who believed a genuine threat was imminent. The organization of the supplies, the types of items chosen, and the quantity suggested someone with actual knowledge of emergency preparedness. As they transported the patient to the hospital, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were seeing pieces of a larger puzzle. The increased tension in the city, the uptick in violence, the paranoia, and now evidence that at least some people were actively preparing for some kind of event. His instincts were telling him that something significant was building, but he had no idea what. Back at the hospital, as they transferred the patient to the emergency department, Marcus noticed something else unusual. There were more security guards than normal, and they seemed more alert than typical hospital security. Dr. Williams was speaking quietly with a man in a suit whom Marcus didn't recognize, possibly law enforcement or administration. "Partner," Ginny said, touching his arm. "You're doing the staring thing again. What's got you so wound up today?" Marcus realized he'd been unconsciously scanning the emergency department the way he used to scan potentially hostile areas during his military service. His training was taking over, responding to subtle environmental cues that suggested elevated threat levels. But he couldn't explain this to Ginny without revealing parts of his past that he wasn't ready to discuss. "Just tired, I guess. Long shift. Maybe you should talk to someone about the stress. The department has counseling services, you know, and there's no shame in using them." Marcus nodded, though he knew that standard counseling wouldn't address his particular situation. His stress wasn't coming from typical work pressures. It was coming from the collision between his civilian identity and military instincts that were increasingly active. His body and mind were responding to environmental cues that suggested danger, but he was supposed to be a paramedic, not a soldier. As their shift ended and Marcus drove home to his small apartment across town, he found himself taking a different route than usual, one that avoided potential choke points and offered better visibility. It was an automatic response, one that he didn't even consciously decide to make. His military training was asserting itself more strongly than it had in years. That night, as Marcus tried to fall asleep, he found himself thinking about Dr. Peterson's words regarding integration. Maybe the problem wasn't that his military training was interfering with his civilian life. Maybe the problem was that he'd been trying to suppress a part of himself that could actually be useful. His instincts were telling him that something was wrong in the city, and those same instincts had kept him alive in much more dangerous situations. The nightmares came again that night, but they were different this time. Instead of fragmented memories of past conflicts, he dreamed about the hospital, specifically about protecting it. In the dream, he was positioned on a rooftop across from St. Mary's, watching through a scope, waiting for a threat that he knew was coming. The dream felt less like a nightmare and more like a premonition. Marcus woke with a start, his heart pounding. The clock read 3:17 a.m., and he was covered in sweat. But, for the first time in weeks, the feeling wasn't entirely unpleasant. There had been something almost comforting about the dream version of himself. Confident, prepared, and ready to protect something that mattered to him. He got up and walked to his bedroom window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, he was certain that events were building towards something significant. His military instincts were screaming warnings that his civilian mind was trying to ignore. The question was whether he should trust those instincts or continue trying to suppress them. As he stood at the window, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of fighting against his military training, he was going to start paying attention to it. If his instincts were right and something was coming, then maybe his unique combination of medical skills and military experience wasn't a burden to overcome. Maybe it was exactly what would be needed. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start preparing for whatever was coming. Not as Marcus Chun, the paramedic trying to forget his past, but as someone who could bridge both worlds if necessary. He didn't know what form the threat would take, but he was certain that the growing tension in the city was building towards something that would require every skill he possessed. The city slept on, unaware that one of its emergency responders had just made a decision that would soon prove to be crucial for everyone's survival. 3 weeks after Marcus had decided to start trusting his instincts again, the subtle changes in the city had become impossible to ignore. What had begun as an increase in routine violence had evolved into something more systematic and concerning. Emergency calls were taking on a different character, and even the most experienced first responders were beginning to notice patterns that didn't fit normal urban crime statistics. Marcus arrived at work early that Tuesday morning, a habit he'd developed since deciding to pay closer attention to his environment. The extra time allowed him to review incident reports from other shifts, something most paramedics didn't bother with unless specifically required. But his military background had taught him the value of intelligence gathering, and he was starting to see connections that others missed. Ginny found him in the break room, surrounded by paperwork and looking more serious than usual. "Please tell me you're not turning into one of those people who brings work home," she said, pouring herself coffee. "Because I refuse to partner with someone who color codes incident reports." "Just trying to understand some trends," Marcus replied, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Have you looked at the call logs from the past month?" "Why would I torture myself like that? We live it once. Isn't that enough?" Ginny sat down across from him, studying his face. "Okay, what's really going on? You've been different lately. More intense, more military, if that makes sense." Marcus felt a moment of panic. Had he been that obvious about reverting to his old patterns? "I'm not sure what you mean." "Come on, partner. I've been working with you for 3 years. I know when you're stressed about a patient, tired from a long shift, or worried about a call. This is different. You're scanning rooms like you expect trouble. You've changed how you position yourself during patient care. And yesterday, I caught you checking sight lines from the ambulance." Ginny leaned forward. "There's nothing wrong with military training carrying over into civilian work, but you've been acting like you're expecting a war zone." Before Marcus could respond, Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but we need to talk. Both of you." Her expression was grave, and she gestured for them to follow her to her office. Dr. Williams closed the door behind them and gestured to 2 chairs. On her desk were several official-looking documents and what appeared to be a briefing folder. "I've just come from a meeting with hospital administration, the police chief, and some federal representatives. There's been a development that affects all emergency personnel." Marcus's military instincts immediately focused. Federal involvement meant the situation had escalated beyond local law enforcement capabilities. What kind of development? Over the past 6 weeks, there have been 17 separate incidents across the country involving attacks on medical facilities. Not just hospitals, ambulances, urgent care centers, even pharmacy robberies that seem to target specific medications. The FBI believes these incidents are connected and that more attacks are planned. Ginny sat forward in her chair. "Connected how? Are we talking about terrorism?" "They're not sure yet. The attacks haven't followed typical terrorist patterns. No group has claimed responsibility. No political demands have been made, and the targets seem almost random except for the medical connection. But there are enough similarities in methodology to suggest coordination." Dr. Williams opened the briefing folder and pulled out several photographs. Marcus immediately recognized them as crime scene photos, and his trained eye automatically began analyzing them for tactical information. The attackers have shown unusual knowledge of hospital layouts, security procedures, and medical protocols. They're specifically targeting high-value medications, medical equipment, and, in some cases, patient records. "What does this mean for us?" Ginny asked, though Marcus was already formulating the answer based on his military experience. "Heightened security measures, modified protocols for emergency calls, and additional training for all staff," Dr. Williams replied. "But there's something else. The federal team is looking for personnel with specific skill sets to serve as liaisons. Military experience, particularly in threat assessment and tactical situations, is considered valuable." Marcus felt Ginny's eyes on him before Dr. Williams's words fully registered. His partner was putting pieces together faster than he'd expected. "Marcus has military experience," Ginny said quietly. "Don't you?" There was no point in denying it anymore. The situation had evolved beyond his ability to maintain the separation between his identities. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Army sniper. Dr. Williams nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "The federal team wants to interview you this afternoon. They're setting up a coordination center here at the hospital, and they need people who understand both medical operations and security threats." "Interview me for what exactly?" Consultation, initially, help them understand how someone with military training might approach targeting a medical facility. Eventually, they might want you to serve as a tactical advisor for our emergency response team. Marcus felt the weight of the moment. He'd spent 8 years trying to leave his military identity behind, and now circumstances were pulling him back toward exactly the skills he'd tried to forget. But if his instincts were right about the growing threat level, those skills might be exactly what was needed. There's something else, Dr. Williams continued. The attacks have been escalating. The most recent incident was in Phoenix, and it involved multiple shooters with sophisticated equipment. 3 hospital staff members were killed, and the attackers managed to steal a significant amount of medical supplies and controlled substances. Jenny was staring at Marcus with a mixture of surprise and understanding. That's why you've been acting different lately. You sensed something was wrong. Military training teaches you to pay attention to environmental changes that might indicate threats, Marcus explained. The increased violence, the paranoia, the survivalist behavior we've been seeing, it could all be related to preparation for something larger. The federal team thinks so too, Dr. Williams said. They believe the earlier incidents were reconnaissance and testing. Now they're moving to operational phases, and hospitals are likely primary targets. The radio in Marcus's belt crackled to life. All units, we have a priority call. Possible active shooter at Roosevelt Elementary School. Multiple ambulances requested. The 3 of them looked at each other for a moment before the training kicked in. Marcus and Jenny grabbed their gear and headed for the ambulance. But Marcus's mind was processing the call differently than he would have just a few weeks earlier. An elementary school shooting could be connected to the pattern they'd been discussing, or it could be a coincidence that would stretch emergency resources thin while other attacks were planned. As they drove toward the school, Marcus found himself automatically assessing the route for potential ambush points, secondary attack locations, and escape routes. Jenny was focused on preparing medical equipment, but Marcus was thinking about how a coordinated attack might use one incident to draw emergency responders into vulnerable positions while striking the real targets. Dispatch, this is Ambulance 7, Marcus radioed. Can you confirm the number of units responding to Roosevelt Elementary and current status of other emergency services? Ambulance 7, we have 4 units en route to Roosevelt, 2 fire trucks, and multiple police units. Why do you need to know? Just checking resource allocation, Marcus replied. But he was actually wondering if the hospital might be more vulnerable with multiple ambulances away from the building. When they arrived at the school, the situation was already under control. What had been reported as an active shooter turned out to be a teacher who'd suffered a psychological breakdown and had been making threatening statements, but no actual weapons were involved. However, Marcus noticed something that made him uncomfortable. While they were treating the teacher for what appeared to be a panic attack, Marcus observed several people in the crowd of onlookers who didn't seem to belong. They weren't parents, teachers, or obvious community members. They were positioned at strategic points around the school perimeter, and they seemed more interested in observing the emergency response than in the incident itself. Jenny, don't look directly, but check out the guy in the blue jacket near the fence line, Marcus said quietly while taking the patient's blood pressure. He's been watching our procedures, not the school. Jenny casually glanced in the direction Marcus indicated. You're right. That's weird. Should we say something to police? After we finish here. Marcus managed to point out the suspicious individuals to the responding officers, who questioned them and discovered they had no legitimate reason for being at the scene. While they weren't arrested, the fact that multiple people had positioned themselves to observe emergency response procedures confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion that someone was conducting surveillance on first responders. Back at the hospital, Marcus found himself looking at the building with new eyes. If someone wanted to target a medical facility, St. Mary's would be an obvious choice. It was the primary trauma center for the region. It had multiple emergency entrances, and its location made it accessible from several different directions. The building's layout also included several areas that would be difficult to secure in an emergency. Partner, Jenny said as they restocked their ambulance. I think it's time you told me more about your military background. If we're potentially dealing with coordinated attacks on medical facilities, I'd like to know what we might be up against. Marcus looked around the parking garage, automatically checking for potential surveillance before answering. It was a habit he'd thought he'd broken, but Recent events had brought back all of his old security awareness protocols. Snipers are trained to think systematically about targets. Marcus began. We study approaches, escape routes, timing, and vulnerabilities. If someone with that kind of training was planning to attack a hospital, they would spend weeks learning staff routines, security procedures, and structural weaknesses. And if you were trying to defend a hospital against that kind of attack, Marcus had been thinking about exactly that question for days. You'd need to understand how an attacker would think, anticipate their likely approaches, and position defensive resources accordingly. But hospital staff aren't trained for that kind of situation, and traditional security measures aren't designed for sophisticated attackers. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Williams appearing in the ambulance bay. Marcus, the federal team is here. They'd like to speak with you now. The Federal Coordination Center had been set up in a conference room near the hospital's administrative offices. When Marcus entered, he found 3 people waiting, 2 FBI agents and someone who was obviously military, based on his bearing and the way he assessed Marcus upon introduction. Sergeant Chun, the military representative said, using Marcus's former rank. I'm Colonel Martinez, Army Intelligence. We understand you've been working as a paramedic since your discharge. That's correct, sir. We've reviewed your service record. Exceptional marksmanship scores, commendations for performance under pressure, and specialized training in urban combat situations. Exactly the kind of experience we need to understand the current threat pattern. Agent Sarah Kim, one of the FBI representatives, opened a laptop and showed Marcus a map of the United States with marked locations. 17 incidents so far, all targeting medical facilities. The attackers have shown increasingly sophisticated planning and execution. We believe they're building towards something larger. What makes you think that? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The pattern of targets and timing, Colonel Martinez replied. The early incidents seemed designed to test response times, security procedures, and resource allocation. The more recent attacks have involved theft of specific items that would be useful for extended operations: antibiotics, surgical equipment, communications gear. Agent Kim highlighted several locations on the map. We've identified 12 major medical centers that fit the profile for potential primary targets. St. Mary's is one of them. Marcus studied the map, and his military training immediately began identifying the strategic logic behind the target selection. These are all Level 1 trauma centers in metropolitan areas with significant population density. If someone wanted to maximize impact while disrupting emergency medical services for large geographic areas, these would be logical choices. Exactly. And we believe attacks on these facilities could be coordinated to occur simultaneously, which would overwhelm federal response capabilities. What do you need from me? Colonel Martinez leaned forward. We want you to conduct a threat assessment of this hospital from the perspective of someone planning an attack. Identify vulnerabilities, likely approach routes, and defensive positions. Then, help us develop protocols that hospital staff could implement if an attack occurs. Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This was exactly the kind of situation his military training had prepared him for, but it meant fully embracing the identity he'd been trying to leave behind. I'll need access to building plans, security protocols, and staff schedules. Already arranged. Dr. Williams has full administrative support for this project. As the meeting concluded and Marcus walked back through the hospital corridors, he realized that his 8-year attempt to separate his military and civilian identities was over. The skills that had made him an effective sniper, strategic thinking, attention to detail, ability to anticipate enemy actions, were now exactly what might save the lives of his colleagues and patients. That evening, as Marcus began his assessment of the hospital's vulnerabilities, he felt a sense of clarity that had been missing for years. He wasn't betraying his civilian identity by embracing his military training. He was finally integrating all aspects of himself into someone who could be most effective in the current situation. Jenny found him in the hospital's security office, studying building blueprints and making notes. So, former Army sniper, huh? That explains a lot. I should have told you earlier. Why didn't you? Marcus looked up from the blueprints. Because I wanted to be just a paramedic. I wanted to save lives without thinking about taking them. But it turns out that sometimes the best way to save lives is to be prepared to stop the people who want to take them. Ginny pulled up a chair next to him. Well, partner, looks like we're going to learn some new skills. What can you teach me about thinking like a sniper? As Marcus began explaining tactical concepts to someone he'd been trying to protect from that part of his world, he realized that the integration Dr. Peterson had talked about was finally happening. He wasn't choosing between being a paramedic or a soldier. He was becoming someone who could be both when circumstances required it. Outside the hospital windows, the city continued its normal evening routine, unaware that preparations for its defense were beginning in earnest. Marcus looked at the building plans one more time, this time seeing them not as the familiar workplace he'd known for 8 years, but as a potential battlefield where his unique combination of skills might soon be tested in ways he'd never imagined. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in November, exactly 6 weeks after Marcus had begun working with the federal task force. Ginny was driving Ambulance 7 through the empty downtown streets when their radio erupted with an emergency broadcast that would change everything. All units, this is dispatch with a code red emergency. We have confirmed active shooters at Memorial Hospital downtown. Multiple casualties reported. Gunfire still active. All emergency services proceed with extreme caution. This is not a drill. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the familiar surge of adrenaline kicked in. Memorial Hospital was only 12 blocks from St. Mary's, and, according to the intelligence briefings he'd been part of, coordinated attacks were the most likely scenario. If Memorial was under attack, St. Mary's could be next. Dispatch, this is Ambulance 7, Marcus radioed. What's our assignment? Ambulance 7, respond to staging area 3 blocks south of Memorial. Do not approach the hospital until scene is secured by law enforcement. As Ginny navigated through the dark streets, Marcus was already thinking beyond the immediate call. His threat assessment of St. Mary's had identified several scenarios where an attack on Memorial could be used to draw emergency resources away from other targets. The timing, middle of the night when staffing was minimal, fit the pattern of previous attacks. Ginny, I need you to call St. Mary's and speak directly to Dr. Williams, Marcus said, pulling out his secure phone that Colonel Martinez had given him. Tell her to initiate Lockdown Protocol 7 immediately. Lockdown Protocol 7? What's that? Something we developed for situations exactly like this. While Ginny made the call, Marcus contacted the Task Force Coordination Center. Agent Kim answered on the first ring, which told him the team had been expecting this call. Agent Kim, this is Marcus Chun. Memorial Hospital is under attack. We need to assume St. Mary's is a secondary target. Already mobilizing response teams. Your hospital should be implementing defensive protocols now. How long until you can get back there? Marcus looked at their current location and calculated routes. 20 minutes if traffic cooperates. But we're supposed to respond to Memorial first. Negative. Your priority is St. Mary's. Other units can handle Memorial staging. Marcus felt the conflict between his paramedic responsibilities and his tactical role. Other emergency responders were heading toward Memorial to help casualties, while he was being ordered away from the scene. But if St. Mary's came under attack without adequate preparation, the casualties could be far worse. Ginny, change of plans. We're heading back to St. Mary's. What about the casualties at Memorial? There are 8 other ambulances responding to Memorial. St. Mary's only has us. As they raced through the empty streets toward their own hospital, Marcus's radio crackled with updates from the Memorial incident. 3 shooters had entered through different entrances simultaneously. They were heavily armed and seemed to know the building layout intimately. Security cameras showed them moving systematically through different sections of the hospital, not randomly shooting but apparently searching for specific targets or locations. Marcus, Ginny said, her voice tight with tension, this sounds exactly like what you've been preparing for. Unfortunately, yes. When they arrived at St. Mary's, Marcus was relieved to see that the defensive protocols were already being implemented. Security guards had taken positions at all entrances, interior doors were being locked to create controllable access points, and essential staff were moving to secure areas. Dr. Williams met them at the ambulance bay. All non-essential personnel have been moved to secure areas, she reported. We've contacted patients' families to delay any planned visits, and we've coordinated with police to establish a perimeter. Good. What about the rooftop access? Secured. Hospital maintenance is checking all service entrances, and we've activated the backup communication systems you recommended. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. The protocols they developed were being executed smoothly, but he also knew that if attackers came to St. Mary's with the same level of preparation they'd shown at Memorial, the real test was still ahead. "I need to get to the observation post," Marcus said, referring to a position he'd established on the hospital's highest floor with clear sight lines to all approaches. "Observation post?" Jenny asked. "Marcus, what exactly have you been preparing for?" Before he could answer, the lights in the hospital flickered and went out. Emergency power kicked in immediately, bathing everything in the red glow of backup lighting. Marcus's military training took over completely. "That's not a power failure," he said grimly. Someone cut the main electrical feed. Through the hospital windows, they could see that the surrounding neighborhood still had power. The darkness at St. Mary's was targeted and deliberate. Marcus's radio came alive with reports from the security team. "Security to command. We have movement in the parking structure. Multiple vehicles, lights out, approaching from the north entrance." "Security to command. Suspicious individuals observed on foot approaching the main entrance. They appear to be armed." Dr. Williams looked at Marcus. "This is really happening, isn't it?" "Yes. Jenny, I need you to get to the emergency department and help coordinate patient evacuation to secure areas. Dr. Williams, activate the call tree for off-duty staff and tell them to stay away until this is over." Marcus headed for the stairwell that led to his observation post, taking the steps 3 at a time. The position he'd established was a small storage room on the 7th floor that had been converted into a tactical overlook. It contained communication equipment, first aid supplies, and a rifle case that he'd hoped he would never need to open. As he reached the observation post, Marcus's secure phone rang. Colonel Martinez's voice was tense, but controlled. "Chun, we're tracking the Memorial situation through security feeds. 3 coordinated entry points, military-style equipment, and they seem to be searching for something specific rather than causing maximum casualties. Any word on what they're after?" "Unknown, but they've spent significant time in the pharmacy, medical records, and the emergency department. It's possible they're looking for specific medications, patient information, or medical personnel." Marcus positioned himself at the observation window and began scanning the hospital perimeter with night vision equipment. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. At least 12 individuals in tactical gear were positioning themselves around the building, moving with the kind of coordination that indicated professional training. "Colonel, I count 12 hostiles establishing positions around St. Mary's. This isn't random violence. This is a coordinated military-style assault. Can you identify their equipment and positioning?" Marcus focused his scope on the closest group. Advanced body armor, military-grade weapons, night vision equipment, and communication gear. They're setting up overlapping fields of fire to control all exits. This is a siege, not a raid. The radio in his earpiece crackled with Jenny's voice from the emergency department. "Marcus, we've got a problem down here. Someone just called the main hospital line claiming to represent the group outside. They want to speak with whoever's in charge of hospital security." "Don't let anyone answer that call yet," Marcus replied. "What exactly did they say?" "That they want to negotiate for the release of specific patients and access to certain medical supplies. They said they know the building is prepared for an attack, and they want to avoid unnecessary casualties." Marcus felt his blood run cold. The attackers knew about their defensive preparations, which meant they had been under surveillance for much longer than anyone had realized. This wasn't a random attack on a medical facility. This was a targeted operation against St. Mary's specifically. "Dr. Williams," Marcus radioed, "we need to assume they have detailed intelligence about our protocols and personnel. They may know about the task force presence and my involvement." Through his scope, Marcus watched the attackers take their final positions. They were professional, disciplined, and clearly operating according to a detailed plan. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had positioned themselves exactly where Marcus's threat assessment had predicted they would. For 6 weeks, Marcus had studied every possible approach to the hospital, every sight line, and every tactical advantage an attacker might seek to exploit. More importantly, he had identified positions where a defender with his specific skills could effectively counter those advantages. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years trying to escape his identity as a sniper, but now that identity was the only thing standing between the hospital and a coordinated assault by people with similar training. Colonel Martinez, I need authorization to engage hostile targets if they attempt entry. You're authorized to use whatever force is necessary to protect civilian lives. But, Chun, you should know, we've lost contact with Memorial Hospital. The attack there ended 40 minutes ago, and all 3 shooters escaped. We don't know if they're heading your way as reinforcement. Marcus felt the familiar calm settling over him that he remembered from his military service. The planning phase was over, and now everything depended on execution. He opened the rifle case and began assembling his weapon with movements made automatic by years of training. Jenny, he radioed to his partner, I need you to understand something. The person you've worked with for 3 years is also someone who was trained to neutralize threats exactly like this. I'm going to do everything I can to protect the hospital, but things might get intense very quickly. Just bring everyone home safe, partner. That's what you do. Through his scope, Marcus watched the lead attacker signal his team to begin their approach. 12 armed individuals started moving toward the hospital entrances simultaneously, just as his threat assessment had predicted. They moved with confidence, believing they were attacking a soft target defended only by hospital security. They had no idea that their approach was being watched through the scope of someone who had once been considered one of the Army's most effective snipers, and who had spent 6 weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. Marcus checked his radio communications one final time. All hospital units, this is Overwatch. Hostile approach confirmed. Maintain defensive positions and await my signals. Remember, our goal is protection of patients and staff. Let's bring everyone home. The familiar weight of the rifle in his hands felt both foreign and natural after 8 years away from this role. As he settled into position and began tracking the lead attacker through his scope, Marcus realized that his long journey toward integration was complete. He wasn't choosing between being a paramedic or a soldier. Tonight, he would need to be both. The attackers reached the hospital perimeter and began their final approach, unaware that every step was being tracked by someone who understood their tactics intimately and who had prepared St. Mary's Hospital to become something they hadn't expected, a fortress defended by someone willing and able to fight back. Outside, the storm that had been building for weeks was finally breaking. Inside, Marcus Chun prepared to defend his second home with skills he had never wanted to use again, but which might now save the lives of everyone he had come to care about in his civilian life. The real test of everything he had learned, prepared for, and become was about to begin. The first shot Marcus fired in 8 years shattered the silence of the November night and changed everything. Through his scope, he had watched the lead attacker approach the main entrance of St. Mary's Hospital with the confidence of someone who believed he was assaulting a soft target. The man had advanced to within 30 meters of the door when Marcus squeezed the trigger, sending a precision shot that struck the attacker's weapon and sent him diving for cover behind a concrete barrier. Marcus had deliberately aimed to disable rather than kill, but the message was unmistakable. St. Mary's Hospital was not the easy target the attackers had expected. All units, this is Overwatch, Marcus radioed. First contact established. Hostile advance has been halted. Maintain defensive positions. The reaction from the attacking force was immediate and professional. Instead of panicking or retreating, they adapted their tactics, seeking cover and beginning to move in coordinated patterns that confirmed Marcus's assessment of their training level. These weren't random criminals or domestic terrorists. They were experienced military operators conducting a planned assault. Overwatch, this is Security Post 1, came a voice through Marcus's radio. We count at least 15 hostiles now. 3 additional vehicles just arrived from the east. Marcus shifted his scope to confirm the report and felt his stomach tighten. 15 attackers represented a significant escalation from the intelligence estimates, and their coordinated response suggested this was a much larger operation than anyone had anticipated. Through his earpiece, he could hear Dr. Williams coordinating the movement of patients to secure areas, while Jenny worked to prepare the emergency department for potential casualties. Colonel Martinez, this is Chun. Marcus spoke into his secure phone while keeping his scope trained on the attackers' positions. We've got 15 hostiles with professional equipment and training. This is beyond anything we prepared for. Federal response teams are en route, but they're 20 minutes out. Can you hold that long? Marcus studied the tactical situation through his scope. The attackers had taken positions that provided excellent cover while maintaining sight lines to all hospital entrances. They were settling in for what appeared to be a prolonged siege rather than attempting immediate assault. That was both good news and bad news. It meant less immediate danger to patients and staff, but it also suggested the attackers were confident they could achieve their objectives even with prolonged resistance. I can disrupt their positions and buy time, but I need to understand what they're actually after. This isn't random violence. They have specific objectives. As if in response to his question, the hospital's main phone line rang. Dr. Williams answered according to the protocols they had established, and her voice came through Marcus's radio with obvious tension. Marcus, they want to speak with someone in charge of security. They say they know about the federal task force presence, and they want to negotiate. Put them through to my position. Marcus picked up the secure line and heard a calm, professional voice that chilled him with its familiarity. This was someone with military training similar to his own, someone who understood tactical operations and psychological warfare. This is the operational commander for tonight's mission, the voice said. We understand you have a former military sniper providing overwatch for the hospital. We'd like to discuss terms that avoid unnecessary casualties on either side. Marcus felt the weight of recognition. The attackers weren't just aware of his presence, they had planned for it. This entire operation had been designed with the knowledge that St. Mary's had prepared defensive measures beyond normal hospital security. What are your objectives? Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady while continuing to track targets through his scope. We need access to specific medical records, certain pharmaceutical supplies, and temporary use of surgical facilities. We're prepared to compensate the hospital for any inconvenience, and we have no intention of harming patients or staff who cooperate. And if we refuse, then we'll take what we need by force, and the casualties will be regrettable but necessary. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, processing the implications. This wasn't terrorism in any conventional sense. It sounded more like a military operation that required medical resources and was willing to use force to obtain them. The sophistication of their intelligence and preparation suggested government-level resources, which meant this situation was far more complex than anyone had realized. I need 5 minutes to consult with hospital administration, Marcus said. You have 3 minutes. After that, we resume tactical operations. Marcus immediately contacted Colonel Martinez while scanning the perimeter for any changes in the attackers' positions. Colonel, this is bigger than we thought. They're asking for medical records, pharmaceuticals, and surgical facilities. This sounds like a Black Ops medical mission rather than terrorism. What kind of medical records? Unknown, but the specificity suggests they're looking for particular patients or medical information. This could be related to the Memorial Hospital attack. Maybe they're tracking someone through the medical system. Through his scope, Marcus watched the attackers checking their equipment and adjusting positions. Their discipline and coordination continued to impress and concern him. These were people who knew how to conduct extended operations under pressure. Dr. Williams, Marcus radioed, I need you to think carefully. Have we had any unusual patients recently? Anyone who might have attracted attention from federal agencies or foreign governments? There was the diplomatic mission member who came in last month with the poisoning symptoms. And we've been treating a federal witness who was injured in that car accident 2 weeks ago. But their information should be classified. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. If the attackers were after specific patients or their medical information, it would explain the targeted nature of their approach and their willingness to negotiate rather than simply attack. They needed something specific that only the hospital could provide. Time's up, came the voice through the phone. Have you reached a decision? We're going to need more than 3 minutes to coordinate something this complex, Marcus replied. What guarantees can you offer for patient safety? None, if this takes much longer. We have schedules to maintain. Through his scope, Marcus saw the attackers beginning to move again, advancing toward the hospital entrances in coordinated pairs. The negotiation had been a tactical delay while they prepared for assault, and now they were implementing their primary plan. All units, hostile advance resuming. Maintain defensive positions and protect civilian areas. Marcus settled into the familiar rhythm of precision shooting that his military training had ingrained. He began systematically targeting the attacker's equipment and positions, using his elevated position and superior marksmanship to disrupt their advance without necessarily causing casualties. His first shot disabled the radio equipment of one attacker group, cutting their communication. His second shot shattered the weapon of an attacker approaching the emergency department entrance. His third shot punctured the tire of one of their vehicles, limiting their mobility options. The effect was immediate and exactly what Marcus had hoped for. The attackers found their carefully planned assault disrupted by someone who understood their tactics and could counter them effectively. They took cover and began trying to identify his position, but Marcus had chosen his observation post specifically to be difficult to locate and attack. Security Post 2, this is Overwatch. I need a status report on all entrances. Main entrance secure. Emergency department secure. Service entrances all locked down. They're trying to find alternative access routes. Marcus shifted his scope to the building's perimeter and spotted what he'd been watching for, several attackers moving toward maintenance areas that most people wouldn't know existed. But his threat assessment had identified these vulnerable points, and his defensive preparations had accounted for them. Security teams, hostile approach on maintenance level. Implement Containment Protocol 4. The containment protocols Marcus had developed were designed to funnel any attackers into predictable routes where they could be more easily countered. As he watched through his scope, the attackers found their access routes systematically blocked by obstacles that forced them into exposed positions. Jenny, Marcus radioed to his partner. How are we doing with patient evacuation? Everyone's in secure areas except for 3 patients in intensive care who can't be moved. Dr. Williams is with them. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on him. Everything he'd learned in the military, everything he'd developed as a paramedic, and everything he'd planned during his weeks with the federal task force was being tested simultaneously. The integration he'd struggled with for years was finally complete, but the stakes couldn't have been higher. Through his earpiece, he heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching. Federal response teams were arriving, which should shift the tactical situation significantly. But it also meant the attackers would likely escalate their efforts to complete their mission before facing overwhelming opposition. All units, federal response arriving. Maintain positions and prepare for potential escalation. Marcus watched through his scope as the attackers seemed to reach the same conclusion. Their movements became more urgent, and they began attempting more direct approaches to the hospital entrances. The systematic, patient siege was shifting to aggressive assault as their time window narrowed. Overwatch, this is Security Post 1. We have attackers attempting to breach the main entrance with explosives. Marcus immediately shifted his scope to the main entrance and saw 2 attackers positioning what appeared to be shaped charges against the reinforced doors. His next shot had to be decisive. If they breached the main entrance, the interior defensive positions would be overwhelmed quickly. The shot was one of the most difficult of his career. He had to hit a small target at distance while the attackers were in motion, and he had to do it precisely enough to disrupt their explosives without causing a detonation that might harm his own people inside the building. Marcus steadied his breathing, calculated wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The shot struck the explosive device and sent both attackers scrambling for cover, leaving their breach attempt incomplete. Main entrance breach attempt failed, Marcus reported. Continuing Overwatch. Through his secure phone, Colonel Martinez's voice crackled with static from the approaching helicopters. Chun, federal teams are establishing perimeter control. We need you to maintain your position and provide targeting information for tactical response. Understood. I count 12 hostiles still active, positioned primarily on the north and east sides of the building. They're well equipped and disciplined, but their assault options are limited by the defensive preparations. As the sound of helicopters grew louder, Marcus watched the attackers beginning to withdraw toward their vehicles. Whatever their primary objective had been, they apparently decided that achieving it was no longer possible with federal response teams arriving. All units, hostiles appear to be withdrawing. Maintain defensive positions until federal teams confirm area is secure. Marcus kept his scope trained on the retreating attackers, noting details about their equipment, vehicles, and retreat routes that might be useful for the federal investigation. But he also felt a profound sense of relief that the immediate threat to his colleagues and patients was ending. "Jenny," he radioed to his partner. "Status report on patients and staff? Everyone's okay down here. No casualties, no injuries. Dr. Williams wants to know when we can start normal operations again. Tell her to wait for federal all clear. But it looks like the worst is over." As Marcus watched the last of the attacking vehicles disappear into the night, he realized that his 8-year journey from soldier to paramedic was finally complete. He hadn't had to choose between his identities. He had found a way to integrate them when circumstances demanded it. The skills that had once made him an effective sniper had tonight made him an effective protector of civilians. The discipline and tactical thinking of his military training had combined with the dedication to saving lives that he'd developed as a paramedic to create someone uniquely qualified for the situation that had just unfolded. "All federal units, this is Colonel Martinez. Area is secure. Hospital staff may resume normal operations with continued security presence." Marcus began disassembling his rifle and securing his equipment. In a few hours, he would return to being a paramedic responding to routine calls with Jenny. But tonight had proven that sometimes the best way to save lives was to be prepared to defend them, and that the person he had tried so hard to leave behind was still an essential part of who he needed to be. As he made his way back down to the emergency department, Marcus found Jenny and Dr. Williams waiting for him with expressions that mixed relief, gratitude, and a new understanding of their colleague. "So," Jenny said with a tired smile, "tomorrow's shift is going to seem pretty quiet after tonight." "I hope so," Marcus replied. "I really hope so." Outside, the first rays of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky over the city. St. Mary's Hospital had survived its first night as a battlefield, and the man who had defended it was finally at peace with all aspects of his identity. The integration was complete, and Marcus Chun was ready to face whatever challenges his unique combination of skills might be needed for in the future.